The rain wasn't just falling on Riverwood, Montana. It was trying to drown it, trying to wash the whole tiny town right off the map. And Margaret Collins, dragging her 5-year-old daughter Emma through the mud, was starting to think she should just let it. The stagecoach that had dumped them on the empty train platform was already gone, swallowed by the storm. One minute it was there, the next, just the sound of splashing wheels fading into the thunder. Maggie wrapped a protective arm around Emma's shoulders, her once bright blue dress now a dark, heavy shroud clinging to her skin. Water dripped from her hat, tracing cold paths down her neck. "Is this it, Mama?" Emma's voice was a tiny thread against the roar of the wind. "Is this our new home?" Maggie squeezed her tighter. "Yes, sweetheart, this is it." But Emma, with those old soul eyes of hers, knew something was wrong. She clutched her worn-out doll, its faded dress now as soaked as her own. "Where is everybody? Mr. Hayes said someone would meet us." Maggie's jaw went tight at that name, the name that had promised safety, the name that had lured them 1,000 miles from everything they knew. She forced her voice to stay steady, for Emma's sake. "Maybe the storm kept them away. We'll find someone." But as she scanned the desolate street, a collection of dark, huddled shapes against the violent flashes of lightning, she knew it was a lie. There was no one. They were alone. And that's when Emma went completely still. Her little body froze under Maggie's arm. She whispered a single word, her voice trembling. "Mama." She pointed a small, shaking finger into the downpour. "That man is watching us." Maggie's head snapped in the direction Emma was pointing. At first she saw nothing, just the swirling gray curtain of rain and the ghostly outlines of buildings. Then another bolt of lightning tore the sky open, and the world became a black and white photograph for a split second. And she saw him. He was a tall figure, standing perfectly motionless in the middle of the street. The rain was plastering his long coat to his frame, but he didn't seem to notice. He was just there. A statue carved from shadow and patience. The lightning vanished, plunging them back into darkness. But the image was burned into Maggie's mind, a jagged scar that ran from his temple all the way down to his jaw. Eyes that didn't reflect the light, but seemed to swallow it whole, and a stillness that was more terrifying than any storm. This wasn't a welcome party. This was something else entirely. "Stay here," Maggie ordered, her voice a harsh whisper. But it was too late. Emma had already slipped from her grasp. Before Maggie could even react, her daughter was darting out into the rain, her little boots splashing through the muddy puddles, running straight toward the stranger. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Maggie's chest. Her feet felt like they were nailed to the wooden platform. This was it. This was the end. In this strange, empty town, her daughter was running toward a scarred monster in the dark. "Emma!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking free. "Emma, come back here!" But Emma didn't stop. She reached the man and tilted her face up to his, her copper-colored hair plastered to her cheeks by the rain. Maggie stumbled forward, her heart trying to beat its way out of her throat. As she got closer, she could hear Emma's clear, childish voice cutting through the storm. "Do you know us, mister? They said someone would be here to meet us." The man didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just knelt down, a slow, deliberate movement, until his haunted eyes were level with Emma's. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, Maggie thought he was pulling out a weapon. Instead, he withdrew a clean, white handkerchief. He offered it to Emma, gesturing toward her rain-streaked face. And Emma, my brave, foolish Emma, took it without a shred of fear, as if strange, scarred men offered her handkerchiefs in the middle of biblical floods all the time. "Thank you," she said politely, dabbing at her cheeks. "I'm Emma Collins. This is my mother." She gestured back at Maggie, who had finally reached them, trembling from head to toe. The man's dark eyes lifted to meet Maggie's. They lingered on her face for a moment, and something shifted in their depths. It wasn't recognition, not exactly. It was something older, something that felt like a shared memory she didn't know she had. "Emma," Maggie said, her voice tight with fear. She grabbed her daughter's hand. "We don't bother strangers." "He's not bothering me, Mama," Emma replied with that perfect, infuriating child logic. "I'm bothering him." Before Maggie could argue, a new light cut through the darkness. It was a lantern swinging back and forth as its owner hurried toward them. "Hello there, hello!" Ah, a voice called out, breathless. "My goodness, you must be soaked to the bone." The newcomer was a round, balding man in his 50s, wearing the collar of a preacher. He stopped short when the lantern light fell on the scarred man. "Mr. Harlan," the preacher said, his voice full of surprise, "you've come down from the ridge. A rare sight." The man Harlan straightened to his full height but said nothing. He just gave a slight nod. The preacher turned his attention back to Maggie. "Reverend Joseph Miller," he said, extending a hand. "Forgive our town's welcome. We weren't expecting anyone in this weather." "Margaret Collins," Maggie replied, taking his hand. "And this is my daughter, Emma. We're not visitors, Reverend. We were sent for." Reverend Miller's brow furrowed. "Sent for? By whom?" "Marshall Clayton Hayes," Maggie said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'm to be the teacher for the new school. He arranged everything." The confusion on the Reverend's face deepened into something else, something that looked a lot like pity. He glanced from Maggie to Emma, and then back to the silent, watchful figure of Mr. Harlan. "Marshall Hayes," he started, then stopped. He licked his lips, seeming to search for the right words. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere warm and dry. The church is just up the road." As they turned to leave, Emma looked back at Harlan. She held out his handkerchief, now damp and smudged. "Thank you for letting me borrow this, sir." Harlan just shook his head and pointed at Emma, indicating she should keep it. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded. She beamed at him. "Then I'll wash it and bring it back to you. Where do you live?" "Emma," Maggie scolded, but Harlan surprised them all by pointing, not toward a house in town, but toward the dark, looming hills that surrounded the valley. "Mr. Harlan keeps to himself up on Thunder Ridge," Reverend Miller explained gently. "He's not much for company." Emma studied Harlan with a child's frank curiosity. "Can't you talk, Mr. Harlan?" "Emma!" Maggie gasped, mortified. But Harlan didn't seem offended. He just shook his head and briefly touched his throat. "Oh," Emma said, nodding as if it all made perfect sense. "That's all right. My papa used to say some of the bravest men he knew barely said a word." Something flickered across Harlan's face then. It was gone in an instant, but it was so intense, so full of a pain that felt ancient, that Maggie instinctively pulled Emma closer. "Come along," Reverend Miller urged, his voice strained. "The storm's not letting up." As they followed the preacher toward the safety of the church, Maggie risked one last look back. Harlan hadn't moved. He was still standing there, a solitary figure in the rain, watching them go. And in his eyes she saw a darkness that made the storm seem like a summer shower. She had come to Riverwood to escape a monster. She was starting to realize she might have just walked into a whole new nightmare. The church was small and smelled of pine and damp wool. Reverend Miller led them to a small room in the back, where a pot-bellied stove radiated a welcome heat. "It's not much," he apologized, finding them some dry blankets. "But you can stay here until we get things sorted out." Once they were settled with steaming cups of tea, the Reverend finally got to the point. His kind face was etched with worry. "Now then," he said, his voice low, "about Marshall Hayes." Maggie's fingers tightened around her cup. "Yes? I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding, Mrs. Collins." He took a deep breath. "Marshall Hayes left Riverwood nearly 2 months ago." The tea turned to poison in Maggie's mouth. "No, that can't be right. I have his letter. It came just 3 weeks ago. It confirmed my position, the accommodations, everything." The Reverend just shook his head sadly. "I don't know what to tell you. He was reassigned, or so we were told. We haven't heard a word about a teacher being hired. The schoolhouse isn't even fit for children yet." The room started to spin. It was all a lie. The job, the promise of a new start, the safety. He had sent them here, to this forgotten town in the middle of nowhere, for a reason. But what reason? Was he coming for them? Was this some kind of trap? Her mind raced, trying to piece it all together. Hayes had pursued her from Boston after she discovered he was a married man. He'd tracked her to St. Louis, threatened to use his authority as a U.S. Marshal to have Emma taken from her, declared an unfit mother. Then his letter had arrived. An apology, a chance to make amends. A teaching position in a town so remote, he'd said, that her past would never find her. She had been a fool to believe him, a desperate, terrified fool. Does the man with the scar live all alone? Emma's small voice cut through Maggie's spiraling panic. Reverend Miller seemed relieved to change the subject. Mr. Harlan? Yes, he has a cabin up on the ridge. Came here after the war. What happened to his voice? Emma persisted. Emma, please, Maggie said, her head throbbing. It's a fair question, the Reverend said gently. No one knows for sure. The old-timers say he could speak when he first arrived. But something happened. Some say it was the horrors of battle that stole his voice. Others say it was grief. Grief for what? Emma asked. For whom, perhaps, Miller replied. He lost his brother in the war. They say they were inseparable. A knock at the church door made them all jump. The Reverend excused himself, leaving Maggie alone with her daughter and her terror. What had she done? She had walked them right into a cage, and she didn't even know who held the key. She clutched the silver locket she always wore, a gift from her late husband, John, the man whose memory she was trying to honor by protecting their child. She opened it, staring at the tiny portrait inside. John, smiling in his Union uniform, so young, so unaware of the bullet waiting for him at Antietam. I'm sorry, Mama, Emma said quietly, leaning against her. It's not your fault, sweetheart, Maggie whispered, smoothing her daughter's damp hair. We'll figure this out. We always do. But for the first time, she wasn't sure that was true. The Reverend returned, carrying a tray loaded with bread, cheese, and a pot of steaming stew. His face wore a look of utter astonishment. Our benefactor, he stammered, setting the tray down. It seems Mr. Harlan went home, cooked this, and brought it back. In the storm. He shook his head in disbelief. For a man who doesn't speak, he certainly makes his intentions clear. Maggie stared at the food, the silent, scarred man from the ridge, the man whose grief had supposedly stolen his voice. He had seen them, cold, wet, and afraid, and his first instinct had been to feed them. It didn't make sense. Nothing in this town made sense. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Maggie confessed everything to the Reverend. The lies, the threats, the reason she was running from a man who wore the badge of the law. So you see, she finished, her voice shaking, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a trap. Hayes brought me here for a reason. But if he's not here, where is he? And why Riverwood? Reverend Miller looked grave. I don't know. But I do know this is a small town. Secrets don't stay buried for long here. He rose to his feet. You're safe here for now, and it seems you have a guardian angel of sorts. He gestured toward the empty stew pot. A quiet one, who lives on a mountain and apparently cooks a fine venison stew. As Maggie tried to sleep, listening to the rain on the roof, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Nathaniel Harlan, a man haunted by grief, living alone on a mountain. A man who had shown them more kindness in a few hours than Clayton Hayes had in months of false promises. She clutched her locket, the promise from her real husband engraved on the back. Always keep your promises. She had promised to keep Emma safe. But as the storm outside began to quiet down, the storm inside her was just beginning to rage. Because she was starting to suspect that safety was the last thing she was going to find in Riverwood. And she had a terrible feeling that Nathaniel Harlan was right in the middle of it all. The next morning, the world was washed clean. Sunlight streamed through the church window, painting the small room in stripes of gold. Maggie found Emma awake, carefully folding Harlan's handkerchief. Can we take it back to him today, Mama? She asked. I washed it. Before Maggie could answer, there was a knock at the door. It was Harlan. He looked different in the daylight. Less menacing, more solid. The scar was still there, a brutal white line against his weathered skin, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that wasn't frightening. It was watchful. He held out a small object to Emma. It was a wooden horse, so exquisitely carved that it looked like it might gallop right off her hand. The tiny details, the flowing mane, the flared nostrils, were perfect. Emma gasped, her eyes wide with a delight so pure it made Maggie's heart ache. Did you make this? Emma whispered. Thank you, Mr. Harlan. Harlan's mouth didn't smile, but his eyes did. They crinkled at the corners as he watched Emma cradle the little horse. He met Maggie's gaze, and for a second, she felt like he could see right through her. Not in a threatening way, but with a deep, unsettling understanding. He gave a single nod, then turned and left as silently as he had come. "Well," Reverend Miller said from the doorway, "it seems you've made a powerful friend, or a very curious one at least." Later that day, Maggie met with the town council at the general store. It was run by a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor Whitman, who seemed to be the unofficial heart of Riverwood. The council, a blacksmith, a banker, and an old judge, listened to her story, the edited version about the teaching position. They were surprised but not unwelcoming. They needed a teacher. They had a building, the old assay office, but no money for a salary. "I have some savings," Maggie offered. "I can make it work for a while." They were discussing the details when the bell on the store's door jingled. The entire store went silent. Nathaniel Harland had entered. He nodded briefly to the group and walked to the counter, handing Mrs. Whitman a list. As she gathered his supplies, the silence in the store was thick enough to choke on. These people weren't just wary of him, they were afraid. But Emma wasn't. She ran right up to him, her new friend Sarah Tanner in tow. "Mr. Harlan, I showed Sarah my horse. She thinks it's the prettiest thing she's ever seen." Harlan's stern face softened as he looked at the two little girls. He knelt down and, to the shock of everyone watching, pulled two peppermint sticks from his pocket, offering one to each of them. "I still have your handkerchief," Emma said, patting her pocket. "It's all clean." He glanced up at Maggie, his eyes holding hers for a beat too long. He nodded to Emma, then stood to collect his supplies. As he was about to leave, James Tanner, the blacksmith and Sarah's father, spoke up. "Mr. Harland," he said, his voice full of respect, "that schoolhouse needs a master carpenter's hand. The roof leaks, floors rotted. We're all swamped with spring planting. If you had the time—" The entire town council held its breath. They were asking the town hermit, the silent, scarred man from the mountain, to help them. Harlan stood there for a long moment, his face a mask. Then, to the absolute astonishment of everyone in the room, he gave a single decisive nod. He was going to fix the school. For her, for Emma. As he walked out the door, Mrs. Whitman let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," she said, looking at Maggie. "It seems our new school has a very unexpected champion." Maggie stared at the door Harlan had just walked through. A strange feeling bloomed in her chest. It felt a little like hope, but it also felt a lot like danger, because men like Nathaniel Harlan didn't do things for no reason. He had a reason for helping her, a reason for the gifts, a reason for watching her that first night in the storm. And she was terrified to find out what it was. That afternoon, she and Emma made the climb up Thunder Ridge to return his handkerchief. His cabin wasn't a hermit's hovel. It was a beautiful, sturdy home, with a workshop nearby and a garden already turned for spring. He saw them coming and met them outside, his expression unreadable. He accepted the handkerchief with a nod, then gestured toward the cabin, inviting them in for a meal. The inside was warm and clean, filled with handmade furniture and shelves overflowing with books. It smelled of wood smoke and stew. He'd known they were coming. He'd seen them on the trail from his window. He hadn't been surprised at all. As they ate the delicious venison stew he'd prepared, Emma chattered away, filling the silence. Harlan listened, his eyes attentive, occasionally responding with a nod or a raised eyebrow. After the meal, Emma noticed the only photograph in the cabin, a framed picture on the mantel. Harlan brought it to the table. It showed two men in Union uniforms. One was a younger Harlan, without the scar. The other was clearly his brother. "Your family?" Maggie asked gently. He nodded. Then he pointed to his brother and made a gesture like a rifle firing. "He died in the war," Maggie said softly. "My papa died in the war too," Emma said, her face solemn. Harlan knelt in front of Emma, his gaze intense. He touched his own throat, then shook his head. And Maggie understood. The grief hadn't just stolen his voice. It had been ripped out of him. The war hadn't just taken his brother. It had taken a piece of him too. And he had come to this mountain to bury what was left. But now, for some reason, he was coming down. He was re-engaging with the world. He was fixing the school. He was carving toys. He was doing it all for them. The question was why? And the answer, Maggie suspected, was not going to be a simple one. As they left his cabin and walked back down the mountain, she felt his eyes on them the whole way. He was watching over them, protecting them. But protecting them from what? From Hayes? Or from something else? Something here in Riverwood that she hadn't even seen yet? The quiet mountain man was full of secrets. And Maggie had a sinking feeling that his secrets and her dangers were about to collide. The next few days settled into a strange new routine. Maggie started teaching the children in the church, while Harlan worked tirelessly on the schoolhouse. He was a master craftsman, and under his hands the dilapidated building began to transform. Emma became his shadow, helping him with small tasks, and he seemed to tolerate her constant presence with a quiet patience that amazed Maggie. Life in Riverwood was peaceful, almost too peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm, and Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her fears were confirmed on the fourth day. A stranger arrived on the stagecoach. He was a well-dressed man with cold, calculating eyes, and he started asking questions around town. "He's a private investigator," Mrs. Whitman told Maggie, her voice low and worried. "From back east. He's asking about new women in town, especially women traveling with children." The blood drained from Maggie's face. Hayes had found them. "I told him we had a new teacher," Mrs. Whitman said, her eyes shrewd. "But my memory got a little fuzzy on the details. He's staying at the hotel. You need to be careful, Maggie. Whatever trouble you were running from, it just checked in." The investigator, a man named Peters, never approached her directly, but she felt his gaze on her everywhere she went. It was a predator's gaze, patient and assessing. For 3 days, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The men who worked on the schoolhouse with Harlan always seemed to have tools in their hands that looked suspiciously like weapons. James Tanner kept his forge burning late into the night, the clang of his hammer a defiant heartbeat in the quiet town. Then on the fourth day, the investigator left. Maggie watched the stagecoach disappear down the road, a wave of relief washing over her. "He's gone for now," Mrs. Whitman warned, "but he'll be back, or he'll send his report to whoever hired him." She was right. The relief was short-lived. That very afternoon, another storm rolled in, a violent thunderstorm that shook the tiny cabins. Maggie and Emma were caught in it, and as they huddled inside their small home, listening to the rain hammer on the roof, there was a knock on the door. A sharp, authoritative knock that made Maggie's heart stop. She opened it to find Harlan standing there, soaked to the skin, a bundle of firewood in his arms. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately going to the ceiling, where water was starting to drip through in several places. Without a word, he began placing pots and pans to catch the water. He was offering to fix her roof, on top of everything else he was doing for the school. The storm raged outside, trapping him there. Maggie made tea, and Emma, completely unafraid, showed Harlan her collection of books. They sat at the small table, the giant, scarred man and the little girl, heads bent together over picture books. And in that moment, Maggie saw something that terrified her. She saw a family. She saw a life she had thought was lost to her forever. And she saw how easily it could all be destroyed. The universe seemed to agree. There was a deafening crack of thunder right overhead, followed by the sickening crunch of splintering wood. A huge tree branch, struck by lightning, had crashed down onto their roof. Debris rained down from the ceiling. Emma screamed. Harlan was on his feet in an instant. He ran outside to assess the damage and came back moments later, his face grim. He pointed up, then drew a finger across his throat. The roof wasn't just leaking anymore. It was destroyed. "Where will we sleep, Mama?" Emma cried, her eyes wide with fear. Before Maggie could answer, Harlan pointed out the door, in the direction of his cabin on the ridge. He was offering them shelter. To spend the night, unchaperoned, in the home of the town recluse? The gossip would be merciless. But the alternative was sleeping in a cabin with a giant hole in the roof during a thunderstorm. As if sensing her hesitation, he scribbled a note on his pad. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant. "I will sleep in the workshop. You and Emma will have the cabin. Better gossip than pneumonia." She had no choice. The journey up the mountain was a treacherous nightmare of mud and flashing lightning. But Harlan led them with a steady confidence, sheltering Emma between himself and Maggie. When they finally reached his cabin, a lamp was already burning in the window, a beacon of warmth and safety. He settled them inside, gave Maggie one of his own clean flannel shirts to sleep in, and then retreated to the workshop as promised, leaving them alone in his home. The cabin was a reflection of the man himself, strong, self-sufficient, and filled with a quiet, hidden beauty. On a shelf near the fireplace, Maggie saw a collection of small, exquisitely carved wooden animals: a fox, a deer, a bear, a rabbit. They were like the horse he had given Emma, each one a tiny masterpiece. He was an artist, hiding his talent away on this lonely mountain. As Maggie lay in his bed, with Emma sleeping soundly beside her, she listened to the rain on the roof and the distant thunder. She was wearing his shirt, surrounded by his things, sleeping in his home, and she had never felt more confused or more afraid in her entire life. She had come to Riverwood to escape a man who wanted to control her. And now she was under the protection of a man she didn't understand at all. A man whose kindness felt more dangerous than Hayes's threats, because she was starting to realize that the investigator hadn't just been sent to find her. He had been sent to find out about Harlan. Hayes knew about him. He saw him as a threat. And whatever game Hayes was playing, Nathaniel Harlan was now a piece on the board. A very important and very vulnerable piece. The storm outside had passed, but Maggie knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the real storm was just about to break. The next morning, the fragile piece of their strange new life was shattered. As they walked back into town, Mrs. Whitman met them, her face a mask of grim concern. "Heard about your roof," she said, but her eyes told Maggie that wasn't what was on her mind. "Maggie, that investigator, he wasn't just asking about you. He was asking about Hayes." Maggie's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "He wanted to know if anyone had received letters from a Marshall Hayes, if anyone knew where he was." "He wasn't working for Hayes, Maggie." Mrs. Whitman's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think he was working for Hayes's wife." The world tilted on its axis. Hayes wasn't just a fraud and a bigamist. He was a fugitive. And his wife, the woman he had abandoned back in Boston, was hunting him. And now Maggie and Emma were caught in the crossfire. This changed everything. Hayes hadn't lured her to Riverwood to trap her. He had lured her here to use her and Emma as shields, or as bait, or as pawns in a game so twisted she couldn't even begin to see the rules. That afternoon, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Emma was playing near the schoolhouse, where Harlan and the other men were working. Suddenly, a pile of lumber stacked precariously at the edge of the construction site gave way. It came crashing down right where Emma had been standing moments before. Harlan moved faster than she had ever seen a man move. He threw himself forward, shoving Emma out of the way, taking the brunt of the falling timbers himself. The sound of his body hitting the ground, the sickening crack of wood against bone, would haunt Maggie's nightmares for the rest of her life. He was unconscious, a deep gash on his head bleeding profusely into the dirt. The town doctor, a grim-faced man named Thompson, stitched him up right there on the schoolhouse floor. "It wasn't an accident," James Tanner, the blacksmith, said, his voice a low growl. He held up a piece of wood, a support brace from the lumber pile. "This was cut, sawn nearly all the way through. It was meant to fall. It was a trap meant for Emma, a warning from Hayes. He was telling her that he could get to her daughter anytime he wanted. And Nathaniel Harlan, the silent man from the mountain, had just put himself directly in the line of fire to save her." They carried him to Maggie's cabin. His own home on the ridge was too far, and he needed constant watching. For the next 3 days, Maggie nursed him, cleaning his wound, changing his bandages, sitting by his side as he drifted in and out of consciousness. During those long, quiet hours, she found herself studying his face. The harsh line of the scar seemed softer in sleep. The lines of pain around his eyes were smoothed away. She saw not the town hermit, not the intimidating stranger, but a man who had suffered deeply, a man who, for reasons she couldn't fathom, had decided that she and her daughter were worth protecting, even at the cost of his own life. On the 3rd day he woke up. His eyes were clear, and he seemed to know exactly where he was. He tried to sit up, but she gently pushed him back down. He accepted her authority with a small, weary nod. Their silent communication began. He would write questions on his notepad, and she would answer. He asked about Emma, about the schoolhouse, about her roof. He never asked about himself. His presence in her small home was overwhelming. It was intimate in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, and yet it was also profoundly comforting. At night, he slept on a cot in the main room, a silent guardian. For the first time since she had fled Boston, Maggie felt safe. It was a terrifying feeling. On the fourth evening, a letter arrived. It had come on the stage, delivered by Mrs. Whitman, who had the decency to leave without asking questions. Maggie recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Hayes. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, his elegant script a mockery of the ugliness it conveyed. "I was so distressed to hear about the unfortunate accident at the schoolhouse. It seems Riverwood is a more dangerous place than I had imagined. A young girl needs a father's protection, a firm hand." The threat was no longer veiled. It was raw and direct. But it was the postscript that made her blood turn to ice. "P.S. I hear Nathaniel Harlan has taken an interest in your welfare. A man with his own tragic history. I understand he had a brother. It would be a shame if past tragedies were to repeat themselves. He knew. He knew everything. He knew about Harlan's brother. He was threatening to kill the only man who had shown them any real kindness." She was still staring at the letter, her mind reeling, when a quiet scratching sound made her jump. Harlan was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, holding out his notepad. The single word written on it was a gut punch. Him? He knew who the letter was from. He knew who had tried to kill her daughter. He knew who was coming for them. Maggie finally broke. The tears she had been holding back for months, for years, finally came. She told him everything. About Hayes's lies in Boston, his obsession, his threats, his cruelty. And she showed him the letter. He read it, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. The look in his eyes was the look of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and was not afraid to face it again. He took the pencil and wrote, his hand surprisingly steady. "He's not a marshal." Maggie stared at the words. "What do you mean?" "His name is William Forsythe. He was a lieutenant in the war. A coward and a thief. The real Clayton Hayes was our captain. Forsythe watched him die at Cold Harbor and stole his identity. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Hayes wasn't just a fraud. He was a monster who had built his life on the grave of a good man. "He knows me," Harlan wrote, his pencil pressing so hard it nearly tore the paper. "He knows I was there. He knows I saw what he did. That's why he's threatening me. That's why he's coming to Riverwood. He's not just coming for you. He's coming to silence me. For good." And Maggie finally understood. This was never just about her. It was about a secret buried on a battlefield years ago. A secret that Nathaniel Harlan had carried in his silence, and that William Forsythe was now coming to bury forever, along with anyone who got in his way. She looked at the man before her, his head bandaged, his body bruised, but his eyes blazing with a righteous fire she had never seen before. She had thought he was her protector. She realized now that she was his. They were tied together in this, their pasts and futures hopelessly entangled. Forsythe was coming, and Riverwood was about to become a battleground. The next 10 days were the longest of Maggie's life. The whole town seemed to be coiled like a snake, waiting. Judge Simmons, the old military man from the council, revealed that he had been suspicious of Hayes from the start. He had sent telegrams to his contacts in the Federal Marshal Service. Confirmation had come back. Clayton Hayes was dead. The man impersonating him was William Forsythe, a wanted criminal. But the real marshals were weeks away. Until then, Riverwood was on its own. A quiet, efficient defense was organized. The men took turns standing watch. Mrs. Whitman became the central hub for information, her general store a makeshift command post. And Harlan, though still recovering, became the silent strategist. He knew Forsythe. He knew how he thought. He knew his weaknesses. He moved back to his cabin on the ridge, a strategic lookout point over the only road into town. But every day he came down to see them, to check on their safety, to bring Emma a new carving, to share a quiet moment with Maggie on her porch. In those tense, stolen moments, A bond formed between them. It was forged in shared danger and unspoken understanding. He started teaching her and Emma sign language, a way for them to communicate across a crowded room, a secret language for the coming war. She learned the signs for danger, safe, wait, now. He told her, through his slow, careful writing, more about the war, more about foresight. Forsyte had been responsible for his brother Ethan's death, ordering a suicide mission to cover up his own crimes of selling army supplies on the black market. Harland had tried to report him, but Forsyte, the smooth-talking officer, had twisted the story, painting Harland as a grief-stricken soldier losing his mind. No one had believed him. His silence had begun then, born from the bitter realization that sometimes words are useless. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, he wrote something that made her heart stop. He's not after you. He's after what you have. What I have? Maggie was confused. I have nothing. We left everything behind. He just looked at her, his eyes full of a meaning she couldn't decipher. Then he pointed to the silver locket at her throat. This? She asked, touching it. It was my husband's. A gift. He shook his head and wrote again. The man you knew as John Collins. Was he in the 10th of Vermont Infantry? Maggie's world began to crumble. Yes, yes he was. How did you know that? He was my friend, Harlan wrote, his expression full of a sorrow that was years old. He served with me and my brother, and with Captain Hayes, and with Lieutenant Forsyte. The pieces slammed into place with dizzying force. Her husband, John, hadn't just died in the war. He had served with all of them. He had known Forsyte. He had known what he was. The locket, she whispered, her fingers fumbling to open it. She had looked at the tiny portrait of John 1,000 times, but she had never looked behind it. There was a tiny catch she had never noticed. With trembling fingers, she released it. The portrait swung open. Behind it, tucked into a hidden compartment, was a tiny folded piece of paper. An affidavit written in her husband's hand and signed by 2 other soldiers. It detailed everything. Forsyte's thievery, his cruelty, his responsibility for the deaths of his own men, including Ethan Harland. John had been collecting evidence. He had been planning to expose Forsyte, but he had been killed before he could, and he had hidden the proof in the one place he knew would be safe, with her. This was what Forsyte was after, this tiny piece of paper that could destroy him. He hadn't pursued her out of obsession. He had pursued her to retrieve the evidence that could send him to the gallows, and now he was almost here. 2 days later, he rode into town. He looked every inch the confident U.S. Marshal, handsome and smiling, his badge gleaming in the sun. Judge Simmons greeted him with a polite, false welcome. The whole town played their part, pretending ignorance, lulling the predator into a false sense of security. Forsyte's eyes found Maggie immediately. He was charming, gallant, every bit the man who had fooled her in Boston. He presented Emma with a silver bracelet, a snake trying to eat its own tail. The symbolism was not lost on Maggie. He invited her to dinner at the hotel that evening. It was a command, not a request. Judge Simmons gave her a subtle nod. It was part of the plan. Get him in a public place, keep him talking, wait for the right moment. The dinner was a master class in veiled threats. Forsyte spoke of his connections, of the ease with which a child could be taken from an unfit mother. He was tightening the noose, enjoying her fear. But Maggie wasn't the same woman he had terrorized in St. Louis. She looked him in the eye, her voice steady. You seem to know a lot about taking children, Lieutenant Forsyte. The use of his real rank, his real name, made him freeze. The charming mask dropped. For a split second she saw the monster beneath. Pure, cold fury. You've been talking to the mute, he snarled, his voice a low hiss. A foolish mistake, Margaret. A fatal one. Before he could do anything, the hotel doors burst open. It was Emma. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with real terror. Mama, she screamed. It's Mr. Harland, the workshop on the ridge. It's on fire. It was the signal. Maggie's blood ran cold. This wasn't part of the plan. The fire wasn't supposed to be real. They raced through the town, Forsyte right behind them. As they rounded the last bend toward the trail up Thunder Ridge, they saw it. An angry orange glow against the night sky. The fire was real. Someone had betrayed them. As they reached the trailhead, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the investigator, Peters. He held a rifle leveled at Maggie's chest. "The locket, Mrs. Collins," he said calmly. "Give it to me, and the girl doesn't get hurt." Forsythe laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound. "You see, Margaret, you can't win. I always have a backup plan." But he had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten about the town. From the darkness all around them, figures emerged. James Tanner, his blacksmith's hammer held like a war club. Reverend Miller, holding a shotgun with surprising confidence. And dozens of other men, farmers, loggers, ranchers, all armed, all silent, all ready. They had been played. The whole town had set a trap of their own. Peters faltered, his rifle wavering. And in that moment of hesitation, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the trees. It was Harlan. He wasn't on the ridge. He had been here the whole time waiting. He moved with a silent, deadly grace. In 2 strides, he was on Peters, disarming him with brutal efficiency. Forsythe, seeing the trap closing, grabbed Emma. He pulled a pistol from his coat and pressed it to her head. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice raw with panic. "All of you, stay back, or the girl dies." The men froze. Maggie's heart stopped. "Let her go, Forsythe," Harlan said. The words echoed in the stunned silence. His voice was rough, gravelly from years of disuse, but it was strong. It was clear. He had spoken. Forsythe stared at him, his eyes wide with shock. You can talk." "I can," Harlan said, taking a step forward. "And I have a lot to say. About Cold Harbor, about my brother, about the men you murdered." He took another step. "Let the girl go, William. It's over." "It's not over until I have that locket." Forsythe shrieked, his composure shattering. He dragged Emma back, stumbling toward the darkness. "One more step, and I swear I'll—" He never finished the sentence. A high, clear whistle cut through the night, 3 short blasts. From the woods behind Forsythe, a new figure emerged. It was Mrs. Whitman, the 60-year-old shopkeeper, and she was holding a massive buffalo rifle like she had been born with it in her hands. "Drop the gun, you coward," she said, her voice as steady as the rifle's long, dark barrel. Forsythe was trapped. He looked from Harlan to Mrs. Whitman, his eyes wild. He was surrounded, his plans in ashes. With a final desperate scream of rage, he shoved Emma away from him and fired his pistol wildly into the crowd. Then he turned and ran, disappearing into the blackness of the forest. Maggie scooped Emma into her arms, holding her tight, her body shaking with relief. Harlan was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the chaos. "He's gone," Maggie whispered. "Not for long," Harlan said, his voice stronger now, more confident. He looked at Judge Simmons. "He'll head for the old mining trails. He thinks he knows this country, but I know it better." And as the men of Riverwood organized a posse to hunt down the fugitive, Maggie looked at the man beside her, the silent carpenter from Thunder Ridge, the man who had found his voice in the heart of the fire. She realized the locket didn't just hold the proof of Forsythe's crimes. It held the key to Harlan's past, into her future. A future that was, against all odds, beginning right here, in this crazy, brave little town that had refused to let the darkness win. The hunt was on. They tracked him for 2 days through the unforgiving Montana wilderness. Harlan led the posse, moving through the forest with a silence and certainty that was almost supernatural. He read the signs, a broken twig, a disturbed stone, that no one else could see. It was his mountain, his territory, and Forsythe was an intruder. Maggie waited back in Riverwood, the entire town a bundle of nerves. She and Emma stayed with Mrs. Whitman, who kept her buffalo rifle propped by the door and a pot of coffee perpetually brewing. On the 3rd morning they returned. They brought Forsythe with them, tied to a horse, his handsome face bruised and swollen, his expensive clothes torn to rags. He looked like what he was, a cornered rat. They locked him in the town's tiny jail to await the arrival of the real federal marshals. That evening, Harlan came to Maggie's cabin. The little home was whole again, the roof repaired by the men of the town while she and Emma had stayed at the store. He stood on her porch, the setting sun casting long shadows behind him. He looked tired but peaceful. The haunted look was gone from his eyes. "It's really over," Maggie said. It wasn't a question. "It is," he said, his voice still rough, but growing more familiar with every word. "He'll be tried. He'll be convicted. Your husband and my brother, they'll finally have justice." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was another carving. A bird this time, an eagle, its wings spread wide in flight. "For Emma," he said, "to remind her that she's brave. She gets her bravery from her mother," he added, his eyes meeting hers, "and from the man who gave her this." He gently touched the locket at her throat. In that moment, standing on the porch of her small cabin, with the mountains turning purple in the twilight, Maggie knew she was home. She had run from a monster, only to find a community. She had sought refuge, only to find a family. "What will you do now?" she asked him. "The schoolhouse needs a new bell tower," he said with a small smile. "And I hear the teacher is thinking of adding a library wing." "And after that?" She pressed gently. He stepped closer, his large calloused hand finding hers. It fit perfectly. "After that," he said, his voice soft, "I was thinking of building a new house. Up on the ridge. A bigger one. Big enough for a carpenter, and a teacher, and a little girl who likes horses and eagles." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. "It sounds perfect," she whispered. Emma came running out of the cabin then, her face bright with excitement. She saw them holding hands, saw the look on her mother's face, and she smiled a wide, knowing smile that was far too old for her years. She looked at Harlan, the silent, scarred man who had saved them, the man who had found his voice to protect them. "Can you teach me how to talk without words?" she asked. "Like you used to?" Harlan knelt down in front of her, his expression full of a love so profound it took Maggie's breath away. "I can," he said, "but I can also teach you that sometimes the most important words are the ones we finally find the courage to speak out loud." He looked up at Maggie, his eyes asking a question he didn't need to say, and she gave him the answer with a smile that was all the promise he needed. They had all been through the fire, through the storm, and they had come out the other side, not broken, but stronger. A new family forged in the heart of a tiny Montana town that had taught them the true meaning of home. If you were on the edge of your seat through that entire story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the chilling tales we have coming up next. And let me know in the comments below, what was the most shocking twist for you? Was it Foresight's real identity, or the moment Harlan finally spoke? I can't wait to read what you think. Until next time, stay safe out there.